Okay, so let's dive into this. You brought us this source, tackling a really interesting question. How do you even start to estimate something like the number of ATMs in a huge country like India?
Yeah, it's a big puzzle. And this analysis, it sort of walks through one method, starting, of course, with India's massive population. What is it, 1.3 billion people?
Exactly. So our mission here really is to kind of break down this analysis, see the logic, and maybe more importantly, the assumptions they had to make.
Right. How do you get from 1.3 billion people to a specific ATM count? It's quite a process.
It's a great example of how these big estimates get built piece by piece.
Absolutely. And you hit on the core challenge, right? You've got this enormous number, the population, and you need a structured way, set of filters almost, to get to a much smaller number.
So where does the analysis begin? What's the first big assumption?
It starts by splitting that population. The source assumes a 70% rural, 30% urban divide.
Okay, 70.30. So applying that to the 1.3 billion gives you what, roughly 900 million rural?
Uh-huh. About 900 million rural. And yeah, around 400 million urban. Still huge numbers, obviously.
But it's that first step, right? Breaking it down a bit. So what's the next filter they apply?
They move from just people to households, and they make an assumption about average household size.
Which is
4 people per household. Now, interestingly, the source itself notes that, ideally you'd probably use different numbers for rural and urban.
But they kept it simple, just went with 4 across the board for this calculation.
Yeah, exactly. Simplicity seems key here.
Okay, so if you divide those populations, 900 million rural, 400 million urban by 4.
You get the estimated number of households. So about 230 million households in rural India and 100 million in urban areas.
Right, so people to households. Now, how do ATMs fit in? Who's using them?
That's the next layer, ATM card ownership, but at the household level.
Okay, what are the assumptions there?
The analysis assumes 70% of those rural households have ATM cards, maybe reflecting, lower access or need.
And urban.
Yeah.
Higher, I assume.
Yeah, they assume higher penetration in cities. 90% of urban households are assumed to have cards.
Let's quickly crunch those numbers from the source then.
Yeah.
70% of the 230 million rural households. That's about 160 million rural households with cards.
Correct. And then 90% of the 100 million urban households gives you 90 million urban households with cards.
Okay, so we know which households might use an ATM, but that's not the same as users, right? One household might have multiple users or just one.
Exactly. And this is where the analysis gets a bit more specific about the users. For rural, it's pretty straightforward.
Yes, sir.
For those 160 million rural households with cards, they just assume one user per household, 100%.
So 150 million rural ATM users. Simple enough.
Yep. But the urban side has a bit more detail in the source material.
Oh, what's the twist there?
For the 90 million urban households with cards, they split the assumption. They figure 10% of those households actually have 2 users.
Okay, 2 users in 10% of urban card-holding homes, and the rest.
The other 90%, just 1 user, like the rural assumption.
Interesting detail. So how does the math work out for total urban users in the source?
Well, it's like this. You take 10% of the 90 million households, that's 9 million, times 2 users each. So that's 18 million users.
Got it. 18 million from the 2-user households.
Right. Then you take the other 90% of the 90 million households, that's 81 million times 1 user each, which is 81 million users.
So 18 million plus 81 million.
Adds up to 99 million. The analysis kind of rounds that or approximates it to about 100 million urban ATM users.
Okay, makes sense. So we have our estimated user numbers, 160 million rural, 100 million urban. Now the final step, linking users to the actual ATMs.
Exactly. And this is maybe the most critical assumption. How many users does one ATM actually serve?
And they assume different numbers for urban and rural, I guess.
They do, yeah, which kind of feels right. In urban areas, they assume one ATM serves about 500 users. Maybe denser population, more frequent use.
And rural, fewer ATMs, serving more people each.
That's the idea. In rural areas, the assumption is one ATM serves a lot more people, around 2,000 users per machine.
Right, and this is how they get to the final count in source analysis.
For urban ATMs, it's the 100 million users divided by 500 users per ATM.
Which gives you 200,000 urban ATMs.
Yep. And for rural, you take the 160 million users, divide by that higher number, 2,000 users per ATM.
And that comes out to 80,000 rural ATMs.
Exactly.
So you add those together, 200,000 urban, 80,000 rural, and the analysis lands on its final estimate.
280,000 ATMs total for India, according to this specific analysis and its assumptions.
So just to recap what we did here, we basically walked through the source's chain of logic, started with 1.3 billion people.
Applied assumptions about where they live, household size, who has cards, how many users per card.
And finally, how many users per ATM? And step by step, assumption by assumption, it leads down to that 280,000 number.
Precisely. And like you said earlier, it's not really about memorizing 280,000. It's understanding the method.
Yeah, seeing how these complex estimates are constructed, how every number depends on the assumptions made just before it. It's a fundamental way to approach these big, kind of fuzzy problems.
Absolutely. You see this kind of estimation, this market sizing approach everywhere.
And it really brings us back to that interesting point the source itself made right at the start about household size.
Yeah, that simplification. Using just 4 people per household for both urban and rural areas when ideally they'd be different.
So the thought to leave you with is this. How much might that final number 280,000 ATMs change if you just tweak that one early assumption? If you used, say, a smaller average household size for urban areas and maybe a larger one for rural?
It makes you think, doesn't it? How sensitive the whole calculation might be to those initial choices you make along the way, something to mull over.